Hi guys! Today we're going to talk about writing your essay, putting all of the pieces together so you can submit the final product. The lesson objectives of today are writing body paragraphs, writing introductions, writing conclusions, using compare and contrast language, and submitting your final draft and portfolio. Objective 1, writing body paragraphs. We will discuss these components: topic sentences, discussing subject A, which is country 1, comparing contrasting subject B, which is country 2, to subject A, identifying possible causes and/or effects of the similarities differences between the subjects. Topic sentences. These identify the main discussion point of the body paragraph. They focus on only one main idea. They do not include specific details about either subject A or B. Let's look at a couple of examples. Example 1. The gross domestic product, GDP, of a country is the value of all goods and services provided by a country during a certain period of time. The composition of a country's GDP is based on expenses, production, and income. Example 2. Imported goods are the products that a country brings in from other countries. These goods are usually items that a country does not have access to or produce itself. However, sometimes imported goods are also brought in to support global trade and provide variety in the local market. Both of these sentences are very generalized. They identify the main discussion point for that paragraph. So in example 1, the main discussion point is gross domestic product and composition. And in example 2, the main discussion point is imported goods. Moving on to discussing subject A. You're going to write 1 to 2 sentences about subject A for discussion point number 1. This information should come from your own ideas. For example, the GDP of New Zealand is strong when compared to other countries of similar development. Next, you write 1 to 2 sentences about subject A for discussion point number 1 using information from your references. So, for example, in 2017, New Zealand's nominal or current GDP was $204.1 billion. However, adjusted for inflation, the amount was closer to $181 billion. This was an approximate increase of 3.03% from 2016. If we move to the third square, we make sure to include appropriate APA citations to reference the sources. At the end of each sentence, you can see that there is a reference. The first reference in the third square, shows economic overview with the publication year of 2020. The second sentence shows the title of an article, New Zealand versus Kenya, but there's no date, so we have ND. For a reminder about how to cite your references inside your text, refer to the previous video when we talked about using academic sources in your writing. Next, we move on to discussing subject B. Like subject A, you're going to write 1 to 2 sentences comparing, contrasting subject B to subject A for discussion point number 1. This information will come from your own ideas. So, for example, while the GDP of Kenya may be considered strong when compared to other countries of similar development, it is much lower than the GDP of New Zealand. After, we move to including 1 to 2 sentences that come from information in the references. We're still comparing, contrasting the same ideas that we discussed for subject A with subject B. Unlike New Zealand, however, Kenya has experienced a much greater annual increase in GDP over the past decade. On average, the annual growth has been 5 to 6%, with a lesser incline during the 2018-2019 drought. Finally, you want to make sure to include appropriate APA citations to reference your sources. In 2017, Kenya reported a GDP of $163.7 billion, nearly $20 billion less than New Zealand. And then we have a source. If you look at the second example, you'll see that the first sentence does not have a citation, and that's because it's a paraphrased statement. Since there's not any specific data, numbers, or percentages included in the sentence, we don't need to cite the source immediately after that sentence. The source is cited after the second sentence. The last part of each paragraph in your body section will look at the possible causes and effects of the similarities and differences between the two subjects. So let's look at this example. One of the most likely reasons for New Zealand's higher annual GDP is that it is overall a richer nation. Therefore, it can invest more money into service-based economic sectors that have higher financial returns. In contrast, more than 1/3 of Kenya's GDP is based on agriculture, which does not always yield large profits. Another cause of economic disparity is that New Zealand contributes to the skills development of its youth in preparation for their entrance to the workforce. Alternatively, Kenya has plenty of jobs available, but it lacks qualified youth. So what does this look like when we put it all together? This is example body paragraph number 1. I'm not going to read it to you. You can read it on the screen. You can pause the video and go back and look through. But if you see the paragraph, you'll see that all parts that we've previously discussed are included. So we have the topic sentence, we have the discussion about subject A, we have the discussion about subject B, and then we have the discussion about possible causes and effects. So each of your body paragraphs will include this information. Moving on to Objective 2, Writing Introductions. For this section, we will discuss the funnel method and hook, background information, identifying the main idea, and the thesis statement. You may be wondering why we didn't start with the introduction when we're discussing how to write your essay. Believe it or not, you don't have to start with the introduction when you're writing. Sometimes it's easier to start with the body because you have the details and the facts and the information that you want to include. You can write the introduction last. You can write it in the middle. The only important thing is that you write the introduction and it comes at the beginning of your essay when it comes time to turn in the final product. So first we're going to look at what's called the funnel method. Now, do you know what a funnel is? We mentioned this earlier in the semester during one of our classes, but as a reminder, this is a funnel. It's wider at the top and narrower at the bottom. It's used for generally pouring liquid into smaller containers, such as oil or water or honey. So what does this have to do with writing? Well, an introduction also follows the same method by moving from the general to more specific. At the beginning of your introduction, you start with a generalized statement, and we call this statement the hook. The hook is there to grab your reader's attention, to make them interested in what you're going to say, so that they want to continue reading. A couple of examples. One of the characteristic features of first world nations is a strong economy. Example 2. a primary distinction between first world and third world countries is the state of their respective economies. We get the general idea that this text is going to be talking about economy. And with the mention of first world and or third world countries, we know that we're going to be comparing or looking at a couple of different countries. So as we move on from the hook to the next part of the introduction, we're going to become more specific. With background information, you begin to narrow the focus of the text to the topic that will be discussed. In this case, in our example, the topic is the economies of New Zealand and Kenya. Background information does not yet identify the main subjects of comparison and contrast, but it does give clarification to the more generalized hook so readers can smoothly transition from the outside world into your text. For example, originally, the labels of first, second, and third world were used to describe allies of the United States during the Cold War. However, the meaning has shifted to note the difference between the industrialized capitalist countries of the West and the developing countries of the East. This is still a general statement, but it moves our reader's focus to the more specific ideas that we'll be talking about. Next, we're identifying our main idea. This explicitly states the main idea of the text. For compare-contrast writing, subject A and subject B are both identified. However, we do not yet mention the main discussion points. This transitions the reader from the generalized background information to the more specific focus of your text. For example, being considered a third world country does not necessarily mean there is no economic growth or stability. Two countries that fall into the categories of first world and third world countries are New Zealand and Kenya, respectively. Though they're labeled differently, there are still some similarities between their economic achievements. And this leads us to thesis statements. As you recall from a previous video, we said that thesis statements identify the specific purpose of the text, outline the main discussion points, preview the organization of body paragraphs, and clarify the end goal for the reader. So the example thesis statement for this essay: the economies of New Zealand and Kenya can be compared and contrasted by focusing on three main areas of discussion: gross domestic product and its composition, imported goods, and exported goods. Now that we've concluded talking about introductions, we're going to look at the example introduction. I will read this to you because I want you to hear what it sounds like put together. A primary distinction between first world and third world countries is the state of their respective economies. Originally, the labels of first, second, and third world were used to describe allies of the United States during the Cold War. However, the meaning has shifted to note the difference between the industrialized capitalist countries of the West and the developing countries of the East. Being considered a third world country does not necessarily mean there is no economic growth or stability. Two countries that fall into the categories of first world and third world countries are New Zealand and Kenya, respectively. Though they're labeled differently, there are still some similarities between their economic achievements. The economies of New Zealand and Kenya can be compared and contrasted by focusing on three main areas of discussion: gross domestic product and its composition, imported goods, and exported goods. So after we've finished writing the body paragraphs and probably writing the introduction, we're going to write the conclusion. And the conclusion will contain the following components: restating the thesis, summarizing the main ideas, sharing an opinion, making a prediction, or offering a suggestion. Restating the thesis means that you're reminding your readers what your purpose was. You want to make sure that they agree that you fulfilled your purpose. This does not mean that you rewrite or copy your thesis from your introduction. So, as an example, in conclusion, although New Zealand and Kenya fall into different categories of industrialized nations and have many differences between them, there are still several similarities between their economies. This summarizes the thesis statement and restates it in a similar way that reminds the reader what the purpose of the text was. Next, you want to summarize the main discussion points. You want to remind your readers what they were. You do not mention any specific details from the body section. You don't include new information that's not already been discussed in the text, and you don't include any information from references. So as an example, while both countries have an impressively stable GDP, the total value of New Zealand's exports positively affects its overall economy at a greater rate than Kenya's. Still, both countries contribute greatly to the broader international trade market. So we've mentioned the discussion points: GDP, exports, okay? The last part of the conclusion allows you to share an opinion, make a prediction, or offer a suggestion. The conclusion is a good place to share your opinion on the topic. Depending on your text and the purpose for writing, you might want to weigh in on which subject is preferable, which subject is more valuable, or other choices you come up with. For a prediction, what do you think the future holds for your topic and subjects? For an example, while New Zealand has a steady economy and strong GDP, Kenya's GDP appears to be a bit more stable. This could lead to Kenya joining the first world category and surpassing other countries' economic standings. So this is a possible prediction of what could happen in the future. If your essay contains an issue that requires a solution, you can suggest one in the conclusion or make a suggestion based on the current state of your topic, such as, perhaps it's time for the First World Country Club to open up its membership to nations that have shown steady, positive economic growth and potential for continued success. So the example conclusion. In conclusion, although New Zealand and Kenya fall into different categories of industrialized nations and have many differences between them, there are still several similarities between their economies. While both countries have an impressively stable GDP, the total value of New Zealand's exports positively affects its overall economy at a greater rate than Kenya's. Still, both countries contribute greatly to the broader international trade market. While New Zealand has a steady economy and strong GDP, Kenya's GDP appears to be a bit more stable. This could lead to Kenya joining the first world category and surpassing other countries' economic standings. Perhaps it's time for the First World Country Club to open up its membership to nations that have shown steady positive economic growth and potential for continued success. Using compare and contrast language. Today we're going to look at different terminology that you can use in your writing depending on whether you're comparing or contrasting. And these are signal words that tell your reader whether you'll be talking about similarities or differences. Comparative terminology looks at similarities. Comparative phrases show the relationship of similarity between subject A and subject B. So you have some examples of comparative terminology in the middle. These are only examples, and I'm sure not the only ones that you can come up with. We also have a couple of example sentences. Similar to the composition of New Zealand's GDP, Kenya's GDP is also heavily reliant on services. Like New Zealand, Kenya also imports necessities from other countries based on local needs. Contrastive terminology looks at differences. Contrastive phrases show the relationship of dissimilarity between subject A and subject B. You can see some examples in the middle of the screen and example sentences. Unlike New Zealand, however, Kenya has experienced a much greater annual increase in GDP over the past decade. In 2017, however, its most common partners were China, Australia, US, and Japan. You want to try to fit in comparative and contrastive terminology in your writing so that it's clear you're comparing and contrasting and looking at similarities and differences between subjects. Most often, you'll be using these in the second parts of your body paragraphs when you are looking at comparing and contrasting subject B to subject A. Submitting your final draft and portfolio. As we come to the end of the semester, I know that the question is, where do we submit the final draft? What do we include in the portfolio? How are we going to be graded for this assignment? So, we're going to be looking at document formatting, uploading your final draft to Blackboard, understanding the rubric, and uploading your portfolio to Blackboard. Starting with document formatting. Open a new Microsoft Word document. If you don't have Microsoft Word, you can either type your document in Pages and then convert it to a .docx file before uploading to Blackboard, or you can type it for free online using Google Docs or Microsoft Word Online. If you don't know how to convert it, you can either ask me or you can search in Google for converting Pages documents to Microsoft Word format. It's a two-step process. It's very simple. First, the font type and size. This is what the text will look like. You can choose from any of the following font types, and the size depends on which font type you choose. So you can see if you choose Times New Roman, you'll be using 12-point font. Arial, Calibri, and Georgia use 11-point, and then Lucida Sans Unicode uses 10-point. Spacing is double-spaced. The title page looks like this image on the right. So you're going to have your title, and then you have to include all of the information that you see on the right. You can pause the video and zoom in, but what you have is your title, and then you have your name, ID number, Zayed University, the course name, my name, and then the date that the assignment is due, which is November 26th. You don't need to include any headings or a running header on your essay. And your references can be typed starting on the last page of the essay. So if your last paragraph is only, half a page into a page of the document, then you don't have to start your references on a new page. You can just press enter 1 or 2 times and start there to save space. The last thing is not on the list, but I want to point this out because several of you submitted outlines that I made this comment on. Please only use black or blue to type your essay. Please do not type in red or pink or purple or any other color. That's difficult to read. It should be black or blue only. Uploading your final draft to Blackboard. So the deadline to submit is Thursday, 26th of November at 11:59 p.m. There is a late penalty of -2% each day that you are late from your final essay mark. After 6+ days, you will get a 0. So you can be late up to 5 days and you'll lose 10%. Starting day 6 and on, you will get a 0 if you have not turned in your assignment. The steps to upload and submit your assignment to Blackboard are mentioned on the screen. you can pause the video and read through them. If you need assistance, please let me know before the deadline, not after. The rubric is how you will be marked for your assessment. This is the same rubric that we used for the midterm, the open book CRT, for the cause and effect response. There are 5 levels of achievement, and there are 5 criteria: content and development, organization, APA and source integration, style, and then grammar and mechanics. The weighting is the same for the categories as it was for the midterm, with content and development and organization being the largest portion of your mark at 60%. Your portfolio is due on Tuesday, 24th of November, so it's due 2 days before your final draft. The same as with your essay. If you're late, you will lose 2% per day from the final portfolio mark. Starting with day 6 forward, you will receive a 0 for the assignment. Remember that your contents of your portfolio should all be submitted together as one attempt, one submission. You can upload multiple files to the submission, and you need to make sure that you have the following documents as one file when you submit your portfolio. You need to include your brainstorming table with Venn diagram, the final draft of your outline, all of your references, and when you upload your references, you have to include the entire article, not just the links for the sources. So especially for those of you who sent me sources that I was not able to open but you had access to, you must send me the full articles to make sure of that. You also have to include the reliable source checklist for each of the sources that you used, the notes from each of your sources, and the first draft of your essay with my feedback. All of these will be uploaded to the same activity, and the instructions to upload to this assessment are on the screen here. Please note again, if you have issues uploading, you should let me know before the deadline, not after.